All right, so we just saw lists, and now we're talking about tuples, and they're very similar. Now, there are some quite a bit of differences that you don't need to be worried about, but I do want to cover some of the ones that you should keep in mind. Now, first thing, let's talk about how they are similar to lists. So both lists and tuples can store collection of data. They can store heterogeneous data, which means they can have different data types stored inside of them. We can hold integers with decimals. We can hold decimals with character strings and so on. They're both ordered in a way, which means that the way that we create the tuple is going to be the same order which it stays in. So it does not modify the ordering when you supply the information into a tuple. And we can do a lot of common things such as indexing with the brackets in a similar way, and we can combine two tuples with the addition operator and so on. So a lot of those aspects are very similar. But a few things that differ. One is how we create a tuple, right? So with the list, we use the square brackets. With the tuple, we're using the parenthesis brackets, and then we can supply whatever information we want in there for our tuple, right? And so one thing to realize here, and I'll show you in just a second. So let's just make sure we are creating a tuple. In fact, we are. Now, when we are creating a tuple with only a single item, which I would say is not all that common, but it is definitely something to be aware of. If we do it in this manner where we just supply the one item and do nothing else, then the actual type, right, the actual object itself is going to be whatever data type it is, right? So if this was an integer, it would be an integer. If it was a decimal, it would come up as a float, and so on. So the issue here is we are not actually creating a tuple. To create a tuple that only has a single item, we have to include this comma, right? And that's going to signal that, yes, in fact, we are trying to create a tuple, even though we only have one item in there. All right, so another key difference is that once we have a tuple, it is immutable. Okay, so that just means that we cannot actually go ahead, and I could not, let's index for, let's go ahead and index for the first item, right? And let's say I wanted to change this to my full name. Right, we would get an error, right? It does not support item assignment. We can not actually change any pre-existing elements within this tuple, and we can't necessarily grow a tuple. We'd have to create a whole new tuple. So the issue here is there's several different reasons, but one thing that is a side benefit of this is that tuples are actually far more efficient. So Python only assigns the necessary memory for the created tuple. With a list, Python needs to assign memory in a way that allows it to grow, shrink, and change, right? And that does consume more memory. Where a tuple, by having it locked in up front with the memory, we only need to assign the necessary memory for the tuple that is originally created. And the result of that is it makes it more efficient. Now, when we work with these small tuples, it doesn't even matter. But when we're talking about much larger data, that we're storing in tuples, that does have a sizable impact, right? So tuples can be more efficient than lists. And also, it allows us to create objects that can't be changed. So if for some reason we had certain data that we wanted to lock in and not be allowed to modify, to minimize any, let's say, mistakes in overwriting data, then a tuple is a great object to use in that case as well, because it will ensure that data is not changed without explicit reasoning. Okay, so we have our tuple here. Now, another cool thing to be aware of is this thing that we call assignment unpacking, right? This is something that's unique to tuples, and we actually see it quite a bit throughout Python. And we'll see it in this class as well, that certain objects are supplied by a function. The output is supplied as a tuple, but it is designed in a way that we can easily unpack it into, let's say, two different variables. Right, so let's say I've got this tuple here that's got two objects in here, and I want to actually assign the output, right, of this tuple, which is just my name, Brad Bemke, to two variables, first and last name, right? So I can do this, and what this is doing is now that first item in my tuple here is being unpacked into the variable first, and the second item is being unpacked into this second object here, right? So this is, right now it may seem a little bit odd if you haven't seen it before. It's a little bit unique, but it's actually pretty efficient, and we will use this later on in the course. All right, so let's go ahead and check out this knowledge check. We've got this tuple schooling that contains the university, UC, the program identifier, BANA, and then the class identifier. And what we want to do is, well, first we want to go ahead and index for the word BANA. So recall that Python is zero-based indexing, right? So if I were to try to just index for the first, if I wanted the first element, I would have to use 0, which means if I want to get BANA, I actually have to use index value of 1. Right, so that provides me the actual value of that element. Now, next one, it says change the value of BANA to business analytics, right? So we saw with lists, right, if we were to index for an item, we could then assign a new value to that, right? So I could go ahead and do business analytics. And if this were a list, this would work. However, as a tuple, we cannot actually reassign items. Remember, it is immutable, right? So we get an error basically saying tuple does not support item assignment. All right, the last thing is number 3, unpack the schooling tuple into 3 variables. So recall that tuples allow us to do a pretty cool thing of assignment unpacking, right? So we have 3 items in this tuple, and we could unpack them into an individual variable for each item if we wanted to. So in this case, I want to do university, program, and class ID. Now, actually, here's something to kind of point out. When I typed class, you probably saw that this changed into like this bold, right? Class is actually a keyword within Python. And if I were to unpack, let's say I tried to go ahead and unpack my tuple into these 3 elements, or 3 variables, I'd actually get an error because we can't override the internal class keyword. But what we're trying to do is actually assign this to class ID. So when I run that, now what has happened is we've taken the 3 items within schooling and we've unpacked them into their own individual variables. So now if I were to look at my university, I have UC. If I look at program, I have BANA, and if I look at class ID, I have 6043.